Tragedy arrived without ceremony, as it often does, breaking lives not with thunder, but with a single irrevocable moment that rearranges the future. For her, it began with a letter folded too neatly, its words spare and official, informing her that the sea had taken her husband and would not return him. Grief did not come as tears at first, but as a hollowing silence, a private exile within her own name. Widowhood, in early 19th century England, was not merely a change of circumstance. It was a public reduction, a narrowing of space in which a woman was permitted to stand. She learned quickly how the world recalibrated around loss. Doors remained open, yet conversations shortened. Invitations arrived with conditions, sympathy carried an edge, and kindness often came braided with curiosity. She wore mourning not only in cloth but in posture, voice, and restraint, measuring each word so it could not be mistaken for need. Her husband's death at sea had stripped her of protection and placed her under the quiet jurisdiction of opinion. To endure, she traveled toward distant relations, not from hope, but from necessity, accepting dependence as one accepts weather. The Duke, at that same hour, was returning from Parliament with a mind disciplined to duty. He had been raised to govern himself before others, taught that restraint was a form of service and silence a sign of strength. His life had been shaped by expectation, so long that feeling itself seemed an indulgence. Respect followed him, as did loneliness, though few recognized the latter beneath the polish of rank. He measured days by obligations fulfilled, nights by the absence of anything that might disturb his composure. Fate, indifferent to hierarchy, brought them into proximity on a bridge that neither had chosen and both would remember. The hired carriage carrying the widow lurched, not dramatically, but decisively, as if the world itself had misstepped. The moment fractured into sound and motion, into the sharp understanding that something had gone wrong beyond correction. Time seemed to hesitate, granting just enough awareness to make fear precise. The Duke did not think. Thought would have asked permission, weighed consequence, recalled propriety. Instead, instinct rose, swift and unencumbered, and he moved as if obedience to an older law compelled him. Rank dissolved. Reputation vanished. There was only the knowledge that a life was slipping beyond reach, and that he was near enough to try. He entered the river without pause, the cold striking like judgment, the current resisting with blunt force. For the widow, survival arrived as pressure in breath, as the shock of being held by a stranger whose grip was firm without presumption. She did not see him as a title or a rumor, but as an anchor in a moment when the world had failed to keep its footing. When he drew her free, there was no triumph, only urgency, a shared concentration on the simple work of living. Words were unnecessary. Dignity demanded silence. They emerged changed, though neither yet understood how. Onlookers gathered, voices thick with relief and excitement, already reshaping the event into something they could own. The Duke stepped back at once, restoring distance with the precision of habit. He offered his coat, then withdrew his hands, as if reminding himself that boundaries were not abolished by bravery. The widow accepted assistance with gratitude carefully contained, refusing spectacle even as her life had been made public. Society moved quickly to reclaim its order. Questions formed. Whispers practiced their angles. Why had he acted? Why for her? The answers mattered less than the asking. By the time the widow continued her journey, her name had acquired an echo, and the Duke's composure bore the faintest fracture. Each carried away a private reckoning. For her, the knowledge that she had been seen, if only for an instant, without her loss preceding her. For him, the unsettling awareness that obedience to conscience had felt more honest than obedience to expectation. That night, he could not sleep. Not from regret, but from recognition. He had crossed a line without noticing its presence, and the crossing had clarified something long obscured. Honor, he realized, was not diminished by compassion. It was defined by it. The thought unsettled him more than scandal ever could. Elsewhere, the widow lay awake with equal unrest, aware that gratitude, once admitted, had a way of becoming something riskier. By morning, the world would resume its careful judgments, and both would resume their roles. Yet between them now existed an unspoken connection, born of crisis and sustained by restraint. It was not a promise, nor even a hope, but a question newly alive, waiting for courage to answer it. In the days that followed, the incident refused to settle into memory. It lingered as a disturbance, subtle yet persistent, altering how each perceived the structures that governed them. The widow found herself scrutinizing courtesy with new eyes, discerning the difference between politeness and care. She understood now how swiftly a life could be claimed by circumstance, and how rare it was to encounter action unmediated by advantage. The Duke, meanwhile, encountered his own reflection in the reactions of others, noting how praise often concealed alarm, and how admiration could be a warning disguised as approval. He received reports of the event couched in flattery, framed as evidence of noble character, yet threaded with suggestions that such impulses required management. Counsel arrived gently, advising discretion, reminding him of alliances yet to be secured. He listened with courtesy, storing each word as one stores accounts, but felt no relief. Something within him resisted being reduced to anecdote. The rescue had not been a performance. It had been a truth, and truths resisted confinement. For both, the river had altered proportion. Small rules felt heavier, and large vows nearer. Silence gathered meaning. What had been chance now pressed forward as consequence, patient yet insistent, waiting to be named without breaking the fragile order they still obeyed together now. Tragedy returned not as spectacle but as pressure, tightening the space around them until even courtesy felt dangerous. What had begun as a single, undeniable act now lived on as rumor, reshaped by repetition into something sharper and more intrusive. The widow discovered that survival did not end at the river's edge. It merely changed its demands. She had been rescued once, but society required her to rescue herself daily from interpretation, from glances that lingered too long, from sympathy that leaned toward suspicion. Her arrival among distant relations offered shelter, but not ease. Gratitude was expected, invisibility preferred. She fulfilled both with practiced composure, yet the world insisted on reminding her that her story had become shared property. Polite inquiries referenced the accident with a delicacy that felt rehearsed, and each mention carried an unspoken question. What claim, if any, did she now possess upon the man who had saved her? She answered with restraint, refusing narrative embellishment, guarding the truth by keeping it plain. The Duke, meanwhile, encountered a parallel trial, subtler but no less exacting. His peers praised his courage in tones that suggested correction rather than admiration. He was advised, with affectionate gravity, that singular moments must not define a career built upon steadiness. Acts of impulse, he was reminded, invited expectation. Expectation, once stirred, demanded satisfaction. He listened, as he always had, but found himself unmoved by counsel that framed humanity as a liability. Their first contact after the accident came through proper channels, as propriety demanded. A note, formal in address and measured in content, arrived for the widow bearing his seal. It expressed concern for her recovery, nothing more, yet its restraint was its boldness. In a world eager for excess, moderation was a form of defiance. She read it once, then again, absorbing not what was written but what had been carefully omitted. In its courtesy, she sensed intention. In its brevity, respect. Her reply mirrored his tone, offering thanks without invitation, dignity without distance. She sealed it with a steadiness that surprised her, aware that each word carried weight beyond its ink. When his acknowledgment followed, equally contained, a rhythm began, fragile yet persistent, shaped by intervals and anticipation. They spoke without speaking, learning the contours of one another through what remained unsaid. Public encounters followed, unavoidable in a society that prized display. They met beneath trees trimmed into obedience, along gravel paths that echoed with other footsteps. Always there were witnesses, always the careful choreography of greeting and farewell. Yet within these constraints, something shifted. Their conversations, though anchored in convention, carried a cadence of recognition. He listened as if her thoughts mattered. She answered as if his attention were not an anomaly, but a courtesy extended freely. Whispers multiplied, as whispers do when starved of confirmation. Some admired his consistency, others questioned his judgment. For the widow, scrutiny sharpened. She felt the familiar weight of being assessed, yet now it was compounded by proximity to power. Kindness toward her became conditional, edged with advice that pretended concern. She bore it quietly, unwilling to trade independence for approval, even as the cost grew heavier. A turning point arrived in the form of a gift, modest yet deliberate. A book delivered without flourish, its contents marked by a passage he could not have chosen by chance. It spoke of endurance, of storms weathered not by resistance, but by resolve. She recognized the gesture for what it was, an offering of thought rather than possession. Accepting it required courage of a different kind, for gratitude risked misinterpretation. Still, she accepted, honoring the sincerity it represented. The gift did not go unnoticed. Speculation hardened, taking shape as warning. A mutual acquaintance, well-meaning and precise, cautioned her against being misunderstood. She listened, thanked them, and changed nothing. To retreat now would be to concede a guilt she did not bear. The Duke, too, was warned, reminded of futures aligned with advantage, of alliances yet unmade. He heard, acknowledged, and felt the narrowing of choices. Their correspondence slowed, not from disinterest but from pressure. Silence pressed upon them, heavy with implication. Each wondered whether restraint had reached its limit, whether dignity could withstand denial. When they met again, the air between them felt altered, charged by what had been withheld. Polite words carried strain, and courtesy trembled at its edges. In that moment, he offered nothing overt, yet his gaze held a question he had not asked before, and she answered without speaking, aware that whatever came next would demand more than careful distance. Crisis arrived as inevitability, swift and unyielding, reminding them both that hearts could be endangered without warning, and that courage demanded reckoning. The world had closed in around them, tightening the lattice of expectation and propriety until even breaths felt prescribed. The widow felt it most acutely in the quiet hours, when the day's pretense was shed and her thoughts returned to the man who had risked everything for a stranger. Her gratitude had hardened into something more insistent, a steady pulse beneath restraint, yet she dared not name it, fearing that acknowledgment might invite scandal, or worse, rejection. The Duke, too, understood the stakes with sudden clarity. Acts of conscience could not remain confined to private memory when society observed so closely. Every whispered conversation, every polite inquiry, served as a mirror, reflecting the discrepancy between the world he inhabited and the truth of his own feeling. He had always moved with precision, yet the rescue had liberated him from his own rules, leaving him vulnerable in ways he had long denied. Night after night, he reviewed the encounter not as heroism, but as revelation, recognizing the first stirrings of an attachment he could not simply contain. They met once more in the shadow of a meticulously maintained garden, the paths damp with morning dew and the air sharp with the scent of early blooms. Supervision was present, discreet yet unavoidable, yet in their constrained proximity a private dialogue unfolded, delicate and deliberate. Words were few, measured in syllables but vast in implication, each glance weighted with meaning. He asked after her health. She remarked upon her journey, and in those exchanges they traversed miles of unspoken concern. The conversation, polite on its surface, carried the tremor of intimacy, each sentence a cautious brush against something forbidden yet undeniable. The first overt confession came not in speech, but in the careful offering of a letter, written in the solitude of evening hours. It contained not declarations, but reflections, thoughts of danger survived and courage witnessed. She read it beneath a flickering candle, feeling the weight of his attention as though it pressed against her chest, firm yet considerate. In that quiet communion, she recognized a sincerity untouched by expectation, a willingness to engage with her as an equal rather than a subject of rumor. Gratitude ripened into admiration, and admiration, fragile as it was, hinted at the possibility of trust. Yet the world intruded again, swift and merciless. Reports of their correspondence reached ears eager for scandal. Questions arose, subtle but persistent, regarding propriety and influence, loyalty and advantage. Friends, even those most kindly, hinted that she must temper her reception of his attentions, and he must weigh his decisions against the obligations of rank. The Duke found himself negotiating a labyrinth of appearances, balancing his conscience with the rigidity of expectation. He realized that love, when nurtured, required courage of a form far subtler than physical bravery. It required defiance, cloaked in civility. A second, more deliberate token arrived, delivered in the privacy of an unfrequented corridor. A small pressed flower, chosen for its resilience, accompanied by a note suggesting reflection upon endurance and honor. She understood instantly the metaphor, feeling its resonance in her chest. It was not audacious, nor indiscreet, but precise and daring in its delicacy. She placed it carefully within her book, a silent acknowledgment of the bond forming between them, fragile yet growing, shaped by shared awareness rather than public assertion. Their encounters continued under scrutiny, each meeting a test of self-control and subtlety. They learned to speak in the currency of gestures, of inflection, of deliberate pauses. Politeness became a vessel for longing, restraint, a medium for connection. Society, always present, failed to notice the depth beneath the formality, and they both found solace in that invisibility. Conversations became an exercise in double meaning, eyes and posture carrying declarations that words could not safely voice. Inevitably, the turning point arrived as a moment of unscheduled proximity. A sudden summer storm forced them under the eaves of a pavilion, the rain drumming with insistence and the air heavy with heat and scent. There, apart from witnesses yet still bound by expectation, they exchanged a glance that lasted longer than custom allowed. For a heartbeat, the Duke abandoned pretense, and in the tilt of his expression, she saw the totality of his regard. Not admiration, not mere gratitude, but recognition of her as a person of consequence, of intellect, and of courage. Her own response mirrored the admission, tempered by caution but unmistakable in its sincerity. Words followed, careful and weighted, confessions couched in analogy and metaphor. He spoke of storms weathered, of lives endangered and preserved, of honor measured not by status, but by the constancy of action. She responded with acknowledgment of gratitude, yes, but also with the quiet admission that she had found in him a rare constancy and care, the kind of attention that did not seek to possess, but to protect. Each phrase carried risk, each inflection an invitation. Neither could speak freely of desire, yet neither could retreat from its recognition. Outside, society waited, poised to interpret even shadows as statements. The Duke understood that any overt declaration would invite scrutiny, misreading, and perhaps censure. Yet he also recognized that avoidance was itself a statement, one that diminished truth. Thus, he chose a middle path, asserting connection through gesture, careful presence, and the deliberate persistence of engagement. It was a declaration in restraint, a promise in formality, a bond recognized without spectacle. By evening, they parted, each carrying the echo of that exchange like a secret pulse beneath the skin. The widow felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest, not longing alone but recognition that she had been seen, truly seen, by someone of consequence. The Duke felt a similar stirring, an awareness that his sense of duty now included protection not merely of honor or title, but of the fragile life and dignity of another. The incident, though long past in minutes, had become eternal in consequence. Both understood that what began as rescue had become something more complex, a test of patience, of courage, and of the subtle power of integrity. The river had claimed its moment, yet it had set in motion currents neither could fully anticipate. Every social gathering, every letter, every polite conversation would carry the weight of that shared history. The awareness of that connection was at once exhilarating and perilous. As night fell, both retired to solitude, yet sleep remained elusive. The widow traced the outline of the pressed flower in her book, feeling the message contained in its fragile form. The Duke reviewed every word, every glance, measuring the propriety of past actions against the truth of feeling. In the quiet, they each confronted the realization that courage had opened a door neither could now ignore. Their lives, previously governed by rules, had shifted imperceptibly toward something daring, measured, and irrevocable. The story, poised on the precipice of decision, awaited its next turn. Each knew that eventual declaration would demand more than courage. It would demand trust, restraint, and the moral reckoning that comes when society's expectations collide with the impulses of the heart. And though neither could yet speak aloud of the depth forming between them, the undercurrent of connection was undeniable, carrying a promise as subtle as it was potent, that true honor and affection, once recognized, would demand to be acknowledged, even against the weight of history. And so, as the garden paths emptied and the distant lamps flickered against the approaching night, both remained haunted by the same unspoken truth, that the life once saved in a moment of peril had awakened something neither could unlearn, and that tomorrow would require the courage to face not only society's scrutiny, but the undeniable gravity of the heart.